And thanks for hosting my very first book signing, Inquiring Minds, and thank you everybody for coming. Today, she's alive, she's real, you can hold her in your hands, I can hold her in my hands, but more importantly, you should hold her in your hands. And of course, I'll be happy to sign any copies that are purchased today. So birthing Graffiti Grrlz has been a long, very long, 15-year, but fulfilling journey that began in 2002, and over those 15 years has brought me to townships in South Africa, favelas in Brazil, and one particularly stinky, dark, deep, repurposed tunnel in London that functions as a kind of like street art space now. The project began at the University of Arizona in Tucson, where I merged my interests in feminism, visual art, and social and political rebellion by asking what I thought was a pretty simple question: where are the women in graffiti? And actually the first question was, where are the lesbians who write graffiti? But that's another story. I didn't know at the time how a simple question would lead to one of the most important feminist interventions in the world of graffiti studies. And as squeamish as it makes me to make that claim, like my book changes graffiti studies, it is what it is. There's no getting around it. So that's where I'll begin. I'm going to read some excerpts from the introduction that contextualize the work of Graffiti Grrlz in terms of subcultural studies and graffiti studies. All right. So, since the faith of graffiti, the journalist Norman Mailer's 1974 inaugural text, the journalists, criminologists, sociologists, documentarians, and art historians interested in graffiti art have ignored the politics of difference within the subculture. The well-documented tendency of subcultural research to center the activities of boys and men is reproduced throughout the graffiti studies canon. Authors have examined the subculture's relationship to gangs, crime and urban decay, and fine art. They've examined its Afro-Caribbean diasporic aesthetics, its lost potential as an urban art form, its significance as a youth culture and popular culture, its potential use in curriculum development and education, its history, artistic methodologies, innovative use of mediums, its utility as a means for making male masculinity, and its role as a training ground for design careers. The fundamental impetus of getting up, so getting your name on a wall or on any visible surface, and getting away with it, combined with the anonymity provided by the tag name that the graffiti writer uses, has encouraged scholars and graffiti writers to repetitively bolster a rather romantic notion about the subculture's social dynamics. And here I have a couple of quotes, but I'll just read you one, and it comes from a book called Graffito, which is one of the highly cherished books in graffiti world. The graffiti subculture may be the only art form that truly transcends social boundaries. In the world of the graffiti writer, the only thing that one is judged by is artistic skill and attitude. Race, gender, social class, and age of a writer aren't considered. So according to this narrative, the focus on the graffiti art rather than the graffiti art maker enables the subculture to transcend the oppressive and unjust function of difference. The idea is that gender, race, ethnicity, class, and sexuality simply do not matter because they do not affect one's ability to get up and get over. All that matters is proliferation and stylistic innovation. If Case 2 could get up on trains with one arm, and if Lady Pink, who's known to be like super duper short, could paint whole trains alone, and if Iz the Wiz could become one of the most respected all-city kings even though he's white, then obviously differences such as physical ability, gender, and race really don't matter, right? In Girls and Subcultures, Angela McRobbie and Jenny Garber ask, are girls really not present in youth subcultures, or is it something in the way this kind of research is carried out that renders them invisible? They assert that girls' involvement in subcultures may have become invisible because the very term subculture has acquired such strong masculine overtones. And they conclude by arguing that researchers are not looking in the right kinds of places for girls' subcultural activities. Graph girls are not absent from graffiti studies simply because there are not as many women writers, which is the common, you'll hear that over and over again, but because the lens or the conventional way of seeing renders them and their contributions illegible and invisible. Their erasure is and has been taken for granted, naturalized as common sense, a circular and self-fulfilling rationalization. So there are no graffiti girls on the wall or at the events or in the books because, well, there are none, right? So what I try to do with Graffiti Grrlz is provide a different lens, right? To say that, like, yes, there of course are girls who write graffiti, and yes, they're worth mentioning, but more importantly, that the politics of difference related to gender is an active component of the subculture and actually wholly affects how we're able to see them or not see them, as the case may be. And in fact, that it's male privilege that enables the rhetoric of, right, that there just aren't enough of them, or that male privilege informs the idea that, like, difference doesn't matter within the subculture, right? Okay. So the next section, it's also in the introduction, and this is the part where I talk about performing feminism like a girl. And so girl in my book is spelled with a riot girl double R for flair, and a hip hop Z instead of an S. So when I say performing feminism like a girl or graffiti girl, I'm not referring to adolescent girls, right? These are women mostly in their, like, I think the youngest when I first interviewed her was 17 and the oldest was something like 56. So there's a very large age range, but they're all girls. Okay. Graffiti Grrlz, Performing Feminism in the Hip Hop Diaspora, tells an alternative story about graffiti subculture, a story about the art of getting ovaries, that considers the performance of feminism in everyday life as a graffiti girl. Donya, a New York City-based writer, a New York City-based graph girl most active in the 90s and early 2000s, painted this phrase on a wall as her, quote, tongue-in-cheek response to a book that was called The Art of Getting Over, so The Art of Getting Ovaries, that was published without any reference to women writers, and she says that the book was coming out of a circle where there were some girls really moving and shaking. This is her. I was bummed that he didn't give props. I was also very into calling out my female perspective. I always threw something in my pieces, whether it be a tag or some imagery that called attention to the fact that I was a girl. Donya's modification of The Art of Getting Over is a feminist performance of difference that provokes recognition of her presence each time the image is viewed. And I wish I could show you big, beautiful color images, but in the book, on page 37, or if you get the ebook version, you can see the color. You'll see that her name is here, and then it says The Art of Getting Ovaries here, which when you're outside of the world of graffiti, it doesn't seem like a big deal, but it was a clapback, like you published this book without us, and we noticed. Without a declaration of gender difference, the gendered, racialized, and class subject produced in the social imaginary would conceal Donya as the one who got up. So when you close your eyes and I say graffiti writer, it's probably not Donya, right? It's probably not an Italian girl the person might be from the Bronx, but it's probably not a girl, right? For example, when describing the reasoning behind the bow, she adds to her letters, MRS, that's her tag name, an Italian Puerto Rican writer from the Bronx, explained that even though she didn't care at first that most people thought she was a guy, she added the bow to make it more girly. So now her MRS has a bow on the M, okay? Usually a bright pink poofy one. You can't miss it. At first I didn't know if it was a good thing or a bad thing that people thought I was a guy. I guess I thought it was a good thing because girls are considered beneath men in graffiti. It's like, oh, you only want to paint because you want attention. So I wasn't getting that, so I guess that was cool, but I also didn't want to be thought of as a guy because I'm not, you know? Like MRS, Donya wanted her gender acknowledged, so she discursively removed the default subject of hip-hop's cultural production from her painting. When the image circulates from one place to another, so from the wall, photograph, to the web, the recognition for the doing returns, as it should, to her. The performative force of Donya's utterance on the wall demonstrates the power of declaring, rather than erasing or being ambiguous, about gender difference. Similar to my contention that we must imagine the boundaries of hip hop diaspora through performed aesthetics, which I talked about earlier in the introduction, my approach to feminism and feminist movement is also deeply rooted in performance. I identify feminist acts by examining texts, gestures, and images through a simple question that characterizes feminism as a verb. What does it do? Like the fact that a woman does not a feminist make, not all acts performed by graffiti girls can be deemed feminist ones. Indeed, not all acts performed by self-identified feminists are feminist ones. I focus here on performances that expose and ameliorate the various injustices, biases, subjugations, and oppressions based on difference within the subculture. My contention that these performances are feminist is not to place the identity of feminists on these graffiti girls, because that would be a kind of discursive dominance. I utilize the performance of feminism as a strategy for organizing the common doings of a large group of individuals with vastly different identities. No matter how they identify or disidentify with feminism, what I am interested in is the collective effects of their actions. So when I refer to the performance of feminism, I'm referring very specifically to acts that have the effect of creating solidarity and difference, fostering empowerment, cultivating community, promoting social justice, reclaiming pleasure and joy, asserting presence in public space, and restoring bodily agency. So the funny thing is that the primary lesson I learned in writing this book was something I thought I knew going in, right? Or about something I thought I knew going in, which was all about feminism, right? I thought I had it all figured out. What is feminism? How do we identify a feminist? What kind of person might they be? How do we see or recognize feminist movement when it's happening outside of feminist movement? And I learned these lessons by accident because I went into the project taking for granted that these women would identify as feminists. They are rebels, they are fundamentally lawbreakers, and not just because they are vandals, right, engaged in vandalism, but they're also social lawbreakers because they perform a gender expression beyond a binary. They're unapologetically gritty, and they're raw, and they're risky, but they're not all feminists. So I have a whole chapter on that now. The chapter is called Doing Feminist Community Without Feminist Identity, and in there I talk about 3 all-girl crews. So usually graffiti crews are all men with like one token girl. And so this chapter I focus on crews that are all women, which is an anomaly, and I'll talk about that in a second. Okay, so it begins with a quote. I began experimenting with painting in 1999, and I take breaks only when it's necessary to prioritize caring for my daughter. Moments after we sit down in her Santiago apartment, Chilean grafitera Solitas is beckoned by the unmistakable sound of the notorious B.I.G.'s Big Papa on her cell phone. As if on cue, the demands of motherhood take precedent, and we head out to pick up her daughter. Sitting at a restaurant a couple of hours later, the avowed anarchist explains that she and her friends were exposed to graffiti as an element of hip-hop alongside rap music. Making sure to first highlight the egalitarian ethics of her current graffiti crew, Doce Brillos, she added that she experienced resistance from everyone in her earliest years of painting, so she started in like 2003. The standard sentiment then was that la mujer no puede, that women, they told her, cannot paint. And this is her. Everybody thinks that. I became very critical about my position. I was always thinking about women and about the discrimination we encounter just because we are women. I paint to fight the resistance against girls doing graffiti. Everybody says women can't paint graffiti, and I say no. There are women in other places who feel the same as I do. Because more and more girls started painting, the boys are used to it now. Still today, here in Chile, the men don't consider us real competition. So she's one of the, this is her piece actually down here on the cover. Solitas attributes the social, subcultural attitude shift, which is from negative to neutral, right, not to positive, to the multiplication of graffiti girls, girls who feel the same as she does about graffiti painting as an act of defiance in a heteropatriarchal subculture. This is her again. I think that a woman has to be a guerrera, a fighter, a warrior. Women are always fighting. She's going to work, she's taking care of the kids, she has to do all of these things. And that is why I consider myself a fighter. I fight for equality. I fight the government.
I watch an Oz Squad.
I fight for a better place to live, as if on cue, the demands of motherhood. That's awesome, buddy. I fight for environmental issues. I fight for a mountain of things. Instantly connecting with the energy she manifested when speaking about her activism, her liberation, and her struggles as a woman and a mother, I asked her if she considered herself a feminist. It was like an offhand, I totally thought I knew the answer, right? And she said, am I just a feminist? No. But I think men and women are equal. The spark that had ignited between us temporarily faded. What did it mean to be just a feminist, I wondered. In her conceptualization, the boundaries of the word could not contain her or the mountain of things she fights for. For me, feminism is the reason I can see the mountain of things worth fighting for. Feminist movement gave me the tools to examine and deconstruct the white supremacist, heteropatriarchal system and build a path to liberation. In that moment, the bridge connecting our commitments revealed itself to be built on a false premise, and I had to check my US-based queer Latina feminist expectations. I expected an affirmation based on our conversation, our shared enthusiasm, and our laughter. Prior to her utterance, I imagined that we were in sync as feminists. I begin this chapter on performing feminist community without feminist identity with this experience for two reasons. One, to share in writing the visceral experience I had as a feminist ethnographer whose desires, expectations, hopes, and frameworks for understanding were fundamentally challenged each time a graph girl discounted feminism, and it was pretty much every time. Okay. And two, to illustrate a significant tension built into the central argument of this book. Graffiti Grrlz provide an alternative perspective on the current state of transnational feminist movement and the potential in contemporary performances of feminism throughout the diaspora, but the majority of the girls do not identify with the word feminist or as part of feminist movement. By the time I met Solitas in August of 2010, I had grown accustomed to holding space for the difference between my perception of Graffiti Grrlz as feminists and their rejection of the term. In one of my earliest interview sessions in 2004, it was my first one, actually, in reference to the fact that many graph girls do not claim feminist identities, Claw Money, a writer from New York, explained that being a feminist graffiti writer meant, quote, just being about it. I didn't put too much thought into her distinction at the time. Rather than developing a particular methodology to navigate the difference, I purposefully left it bare. In the years I had spent researching Graffiti Grrlz aesthetics, social dynamics, history, and politics, I could not integrate the full force of that difference until my fieldwork trip to Chile and Brazil, where all-girl crew formations were relatively common. My thoughts on all-girl crews were heavily influenced by my locale in the United States, specifically New York City. Basically, my fieldwork in the States had taught me that women don't create all-girl crews, and it remains to be true still today. There were only two exceptions. One on the West Coast called Few and Far, and they're like a hybrid skater girl, graffiti girl crew, and then the other is PMS, which is based in the city, but other than that, there are none. But when I traveled elsewhere, they were everywhere, so trying to make sense of those things. The sexualization, tokenization, and marginalization of graph girls breeds a culture of misogyny that affects how these women relate to one another. Many of the writers I interviewed revealed their fear of being associated with weaker writers, which is just code for girls. Hi, Boo.
I want pizza.
Oh, I want pizza too. Come on. No? Their distaste for women rumored to be writing graffiti solely to gain sexual attention from male peers, and their disdain for women who exploit their minority status for instant fame. All girls, per this logic, are suspect. Like any girl who wants to write graffiti, there are a million reasons why she's suspect, right, for that desire. Within that context, graph girls who participate in all-girl crews jeopardize the respect and reputation they have earned from their peers. So actively rejecting the misogynistic dynamic where graph girls are suspect is a revolutionary feminist act. The commonality of all-girl crews does not simply amend the status quo in this subculture. Instead, it creates a new politics of relation between girls and a standard for other writers to reproduce. So the rest of the chapter, I talk about the different crews, and I explain how, without being tied to official feminist movements, they build, and without claiming a feminist mantle, they build feminist community and do feminist work. So let's see, one more little bit here. The primary lesson about the importance of getting up, which I talked about earlier, is not limited to the act of writing graffiti. Getting up is a subcultural ethos guiding writers' behavior in general. For a writer to be a writer, they must get up, actions over words. Or in Claw's refrain, do not talk about it, be about it. Integrating this ethos, the question of who is or is not a feminist becomes secondary to what feminist actions are being taken in the subculture. Feminism is part of the performance of their everyday lives, despite not always being their mode of self-identification. It was in these two countries, Brazil and Chile, that I accepted the fundamental and provocative reality that we need not call ourselves feminists to enact feminist change in the world. And that's a that is a hard sentence to write and publish in your book, because it's not that I don't believe that people should call themselves feminists, but what I'm more interested in is how people live their lives, what the intentionality behind the actions are, and if the word symbolizes something that is more oppressive, right, and not about liberation at all, then why should I expect, right? And further, if I'm only looking for people who identify specifically as feminists, who am I not seeing, right? So I'm trying to sort of navigate those things. One last little bit. I have a helper now. Woo, Powerpuff Girls! Yeah, that's beautiful. Can I finish? Great. No. I hope that Graffiti Grrlz, okay, so this is in the conclusion where I'm talking about like what I want this book to do in the world. I hope that Graffiti Grrlz has created the space for graph girl stories to emerge and demonstrate how they negotiate their belonging to and visibility in a heterosexist, male-dominated subculture embedded in a patriarchal world. Graph Grrlz makes a practice of cultivating the spaces between aesthetic, social, graph girls make a practice of cultivating the spaces between aesthetic, social, and geopolitical binaries by being in and on public space, assertive, aggressive, risk-taking, confident, daring, dominant but not oppressive, playful, hardworking, resistant to convention and prone to deviation, and invested in both independence and collective activity. These girls deconstruct conventional understandings of femininity and masculinity by enacting a gender performance painted outside the lines of socially imposed heteronormative gender binaries. They transcend the limitations of the material world by utilizing the boundless capabilities of the digital to archive themselves and each other, to circulate their digitized images, and to foster transnational communication between girls and beyond national borders. They form all-girl crews and do the feminist work of peer mentorship, sexual empowerment, and consciousness raising, collectively imagining something different, something more, and something better. I dedicated the book, I riffed off a little sticker that came with a subscription to a magazine that no longer exists that was called Catfight. And the sticker said, for all the girls who never wanted to be mother bleeping princesses. So I dedicated the book to all the girls who never wanted to be princesses and all the princesses who are kings, right? So referring back to that subcultural status that really marks when you're called a king, it's because people admire your work. You've put in your time. You've really made some kind of impact right, in your community, in your subculture. So Graffiti Grrlz is an invitation to learn how these women perform their feminism by taking their place within hip-hop graffiti subculture and making their own. But it's also a challenge directed at readers. If we perform feminism unapologetically and aggressively, if we take risks, if we disobey, if we reject white supremacy, patriarchy, heterosexism, settler colonialism, we would not only imagine a better world, but we would actively create one and take our place within it. In other words, I think we could all be kings. Thank you.